We're going to now discuss the relationship between the Phillips curve that we developed in the previous discussion and the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that we've built to describe the macroeconomy. We're going to see as we look at our aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram that it doesn't quite match the Phillips curve. That is, instead of measuring inflation and unemployment, it measures the price level and the amount of output. However, the amount of output in the economy is related to the unemployment rate. The green line in the diagram represents the speed limit of the economy. The long-run aggregate supply tells us how much that we can produce if all resources are employed. And if we try to produce more, that means pushing unemployment below the natural rate. The green line is associated with the natural rate of unemployment, and increases in output mean unemployment is falling as we recruit more workers to produce more output. Although we won't see inflation in the economy, we will see the price level rising in this picture. The price level goes up whenever the economy tries to run faster than the speed limit. Let's do an analysis using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves, and then show how that translates into a movement along a Phillips curve. In the process, we'll see what different expectations make for the Phillips curve in the short run and in the long run. So let's start with an example. Suppose the government decides to increase spending by building a satellite or a new system of roads. The aggregate demand curve shifts outwards as this government spending is added to the other demand in the economy to give us a larger total aggregate demand. At the original price level now, we have excess aggregate demand in the economy as people are trying to buy more than businesses are producing. This excess aggregate demand pushes up the aggregate price level. As the aggregate price level rises, we get adjustment on both sides of the market. On the demand side, higher prices shrink consumer wealth and lead to less consumer spending. Higher prices increase the demand for money, raising interest rates and reducing business spending. And also, higher prices deter foreign spending on the goods from our economy. So aggregate demand decreases. On the supply side, higher prices lead to an increase in output as businesses face sticky wages, sticky prices, and confusion about whether there's general inflation or an improvement in their own profit opportunities. This leads us to a new equilibrium point with an output level, Y1, that's greater than full employment, and a price level, P1, that's greater than the original price level of P0. So notice what you have in this picture, an increase in output correlated with an increase in the price level. That is, more output being produced, which means more workers are employed, and the unemployment rate is falling. It's falling below the natural rate associated with our speed limit or full employment to some rate that's lower than that. More workers being hired in order to produce more output. Now, we don't see an increase in inflation here, but we do see a rising price level. And if we tried to stay faster than the speed limit, over time the price level would just keep rising. And it would be rising at a higher rate the further past the speed limit we tried to drive the economy. So you can see in this picture that as long as we're moving along the short-run aggregate supply curve, there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and the price level. The more output you try to produce, the lower the unemployment rate falls, the higher the price level is going to go. Now that's the short run. In the long run, however, people are going to start to adjust to this higher price level and the higher inflation rate. When they begin to adjust to it, they factor this new inflation rate into their behavior, and the underlying rate of inflation in the economy begins to rise. What happens then is people figure out that we're in an inflationary economy, one that's trying to drive faster than the speed limit. Wages become unstuck, and laborers ask for bigger cost of living adjustments. Prices become unstuck, and businesses raise their prices along with their costs. And finally, people figure out that they're in an inflationary environment, not one that's creating opportunities for their own particular business. When all this happens, we find that everyone begins to push these costs onto their customers by raising the prices they charge for their goods and services. And what ends up happening in the long run is we reach a new short-run aggregate supply curve where the price level is higher, but we've moved all the way back to the full employment level of output. That is, in the long run, we've got to observe the speed limit. In the long run, the price level goes higher, but output goes right back to where it was before. In the short run, there's a trade-off. You can get more output if you're willing to tolerate higher prices. But in the long run, as people pass the prices on, the costs on, as people adjust to the inflationary environment, we are restored to full employment. Even though the price level goes up, there's no increase in output, there's no reduction in unemployment. There's no trade-off in the long run. The only question is, how long does it take us to get to the long run? How long does the short run and the possibility of a trade-off last? Well, that depends. If expectations are adaptive or backward-looking, then we could stay down here along this curve for a relatively long time. This curve would gradually and slowly ratchet up as people see that, well, inflation occurred last year, it's probably going to occur this year too. Getting used to last year's inflation, influencing this year's perception of inflation, influencing next year's. As long as people are looking at what's happened in the past, the rate of adjustment is going to be relatively slow. But if people are forward-looking and have rational expectations, then what happens is the short-run aggregate supply curve moves immediately. People see, look, prices are going to keep adjusting till we get to P infinity. Therefore, everybody goes ahead and raises their prices right now, and we move immediately to the new long-run point. There is no period of trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So a Phillips curve depends on people not having completely, totally rational expectations. That is, if wages and prices are free to adjust immediately and people see where we are in this picture, then we're going to go ding right to this point without any trade-off. On the other hand, if people are able to be fooled, if there are rigidities in the economy from contracts, then you can have the persistence of lower unemployment and higher inflation in the short run. There's a trade-off along the blue curve. Let's now translate this story into a Phillips curve. Here we have a diagram with the inflation rate on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. And I'm going to go ahead and put in our green line, which represents full employment. Here's the unemployment rate that's associated with full employment output. Maybe it's 5%. If you want, in the short run, to have more output and lower unemployment, you've got to tolerate higher prices. If you're willing to tolerate more unemployment and lower output, you can get lower prices or less inflation. However, this only works in the short run, because in the long run, people will get used to this higher rate of inflation. Therefore, they'll change their behavior and go back and supply only the amount of labor that they were supplying before as prices rise to make those new higher wages less interesting. So what happens then in the long run is the Phillips curve shifts up to reflect the new underlying rate of inflation. If you've driven the economy faster than the speed limit, the Phillips curve is going to be shifting up. Now, what's happened in the United States in recent years is that increases in productivity have caused labor costs to rise relatively slowly. This slow increase in labor costs has then put a damper on inflation, and people are now in our economy used to inflation rates of around 2% a year. Therefore, the underlying inflation rate in our economy is relatively low, which means we're able to get a lot of output without a big increase in prices, because contracts, cost of living adjustments, and people's expectations have fixed on an idea that inflation is going to be at a relatively low rate. When the underlying rate of inflation is low because people expect it, then you get a more favorable trade-off in the short run. However, the more expectations become rational, the less likely we are to have any trade-off in the short run at all. The curve just moves up and down along the green line. If expectations are perfectly rational and people are never fooled and wages and prices aren't sticky, there is no Phillips curve. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical, and we're going to be on this curve as long as we are as long as everyone is rational, forward-looking, and is not constrained by fixed wages or fixed prices. The short-run trade-off, the usual Phillips curve, depends on people not being completely rational, or else some wages and some prices in the economy being sticky. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical, and the short-run Phillips curve reflects a trade-off that centers around the underlying rate of inflation. If you drive the economy faster than the speed limit, you can get less unemployment at the cost of higher inflation. If you drive the economy slower, you get less inflation, but at the cost of more unemployment.